Will you commit right now to give Mr. Abrego Garcia that process where you can prove your allegation that he is a member of MS-13?
Congressman, that judge that you just quoted did not say he was not a member of MS-13. Who did say that he was a member of MS-13 was law enforcement officers that encountered this individual.
Yeah, he knows that. This is a Fourth Circuit judge. He knows all of what the evidence is, and he's saying if that evidence. So you're not going to commit to follow this order. You won't commit to follow this court order.
By the way, he identified
Madam Secretary,
himself.
I reclaim my time. Stop filibustering. Stop filibustering.
Things got heated on Capitol Hill when Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman clashed with Republican Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem over the controversial case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. At the heart of the exchange, a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling that said Garcia was denied due process, something Goldman pressed hard on, while Noem dodged, deflected, and outright refused to commit to following the order. What unfolded was a fiery back and forth that exposed just how far Republicans are willing to bend the Constitution when it suits their narrative.
I now recognize Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to go back to Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, Madam Secretary. But my first question for you is a pretty simple one. It's basic civics. Which branch of government does the Constitution give the authority to interpret what the law is, the judiciary or the executive branch?
Sir, going forward, the interpretation of the law, you make the laws in this body. The judicial branch makes sure that they have integrity and they're applied properly to individuals.
So I'm just going to take that as the judiciary branch. Now, let's focus for a second on what the judiciary branch has said about this case. We know the Supreme Court has said 9-0 that notwithstanding your statements under oath here today that Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was afforded due process, he was in fact not afforded due process, because then if he were, you would have seen the withholding order that did not permit him to be deported to El Salvador. Now you allege, and I guess the Attorney General alleges, that he's a member of MS-13. That may very well be the case. And if he is, now that is a foreign terrorist organization, certainly the immigration laws would allow him, and in fact require him, to be deported. I certainly would support that. But the problem that we have here is what you allege, what Ms. Green alleges, what the Attorney General alleges, is not the judiciary. You don't get to decide whether or not he is an MS-13 member. And you don't have to take my word for it, because Judge Wilkinson, a Fourth Circuit judge, very conservative, addressed this argument. He said, the government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident in its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order. Will you commit right now to give Mr. Abrego Garcia that process where you can prove your allegation that he is a member of MS-13?
Congressman, that judge that you just quoted did not say he was not a member of MS-13. Who did say that he was a member of MS-13 was law enforcement officers that encountered this individual.
Yeah, he knows that. This is a Fourth Circuit judge. He knows all of what the evidence is, and he's saying if that evidence. So you're not going to commit to follow this order. You won't commit to follow this court order.
By the way, he identified
Madam Secretary,
himself.
I reclaim my time. Stop filibustering. Stop filibustering.
By gang members of MS-13.
Will you give Mr. Abrego Garcia the due process that the Supreme Court and Judge Wilkinson has required you to give him?
Abrego Garcia is an El Salvador resident who is in his home country. If he were to come back to this country, he would be immediately removed again.
How do you know?
He has received and been treated appropriately,
so
sir, and he is not.
How can you say he's been treated appropriately if the Supreme Court has ruled 9-0? 9-0 that he hasn't been treated appropriately? Why is your opinion better
We had
and
two
have more authority than the Supreme Court.
investigators, 2 judges, an immigration court that all said he was MS-13 and was removed from this country.
But you understand, that is you saying that. That is you saying that.
That is them saying that. This
No,
is
no, no, no.
investigators and law
That is
enforcement
you
officers
making that
in the case they
determination.
built against him. If you don't
The
trust our law
court
enforcement
has
officers
considered all that.
and
The judge has
investigators,
considered all that, Madam
who do you
Secretary.
trust if you
And
don't
if you would be
trust judges?
quiet, because I'm reclaiming my time, you are not following this court order. But let's focus on the court order, because this opinion also says that to facilitate, which the Supreme Court is requiring, is an active verb. It requires that steps be taken. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia to allow him to get due process?
Abrego Garcia is in his home country.
What
If he were to come
steps
back,
have
your
you
advocacy-
taken?
If your continued advocacy for him were to...
I'm not advocating for him.
Yes, you
I'm
are.
advocating for a
Absolutely.
court order, Madam
Gone to the
Secretary.
mat for this
The
man
court order
who has terrorized
says
people
that
in
you
traffic
must take
with human
steps
beings.
to follow the court order. You are here under oath. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia pursuant to this court order?
It's got to be extremely discouraging to be one of your constituents. To see you fight for a terrorist like this and not fight for them is extremely alarming to me.
I'm fighting for due process,
Constituents as
and that's under the Constitution.
Gentleman's
and you
time
should
has
fight too for
expired.
due process.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize
What we saw in this hearing between Representative Dan Goldman and Secretary Kristi Noem was not just another political clash, not just another partisan back and forth that comes and goes in the daily noise of Washington. This was about something far deeper, far more fundamental, whether the Constitution, the rule of law, and the separation of powers still mean anything in America when the executive branch decides it can override even a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. Now, before we even dive into the blow-by-blow of Goldman versus Noem, let's ground ourselves in what's really at stake. Because this is one of those moments where the personalities, Goldman, Noem, Garcia, MS-13, they matter, yes, but they're not the core of the story. The core of the story is power. Who has it, who abuses it, and who is willing to fight to make sure the Constitution still applies, even when it's inconvenient. So let's set the scene. Representative Dan Goldman, Democrat from New York, is known for being sharp, fact-driven, and relentless in hearings. He's not the kind of lawmaker who shouts just to shout. He zeroes in on the legal points. On the other side of the table was Secretary Kristi Noem, who has made a name for herself as a conservative star, a figure who often embraces executive power in the name of security and toughness on crime. And in the middle of it all was the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a man the government has labeled as a member of MS-13, one of the most violent and notorious gangs in the world. Now, let's be clear right up front. MS-13 is brutal. Their crimes are horrific, their violence is well documented, and no one in this conversation, not Goldman, not Democrats, not even Garcia's defenders, is pretending otherwise. But the question isn't whether MS-13 is dangerous. The question is whether the Constitution still applies when the accused is someone you despise. Because if due process doesn't apply to the people we hate, then it doesn't really exist for any of us. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in. Because in this case, the court ruled unanimously, 9-0, that Garcia had been denied due process. Think about how rare that is. We live in an era where the Supreme Court is bitterly divided, where ideological battles define almost every major case. But here, not one justice dissented. Not Roberts, not Alito, not Thomas, not Kavanaugh. All 9 agreed Garcia did not receive due process. That means the executive branch had acted outside the bounds of the Constitution. So Goldman's line of questioning was simple, maybe too simple for Noem's comfort. He started with a civics question. Which branch of government has the authority to interpret the law, the executive or the judiciary? And of course, the answer is the judiciary. Congress makes the laws, the executive enforces the laws, the judiciary interprets the laws. That's separation of power 101, the stuff we all learned in high school. But Noem didn't want to go there. She hedged, she tried to blur the lines, she insisted that the executive branch was right in how it handled Garcia. And that's when Goldman pounced. Because if the Supreme Court says Garcia was denied due process, and if a conservative judge on the Fourth Circuit says the government can allege all it wants, but allegations aren't proof, then the executive branch doesn't get to just wave its hand and say, we've decided otherwise. That's not how democracy works. That's not how checks and balances work. That's not how America works. And here's where Goldman's patience wore thin. When Noem tried to filibuster, when she tried to pivot back to, but he's MS-13, but he's dangerous, Goldman cut in with the line that made this clash viral. If you would be quiet. He wasn't defending Garcia. He wasn't defending MS-13. He was defending the Constitution. And he made it clear. Due process is not optional. It's not situational. It's not something the government gets to apply when it feels like it. It's a constitutional guarantee. Now, let's talk about that guarantee, because this is where so many politicians, especially those who posture as tough on crime, get it wrong. Due process exists precisely because we don't trust the government's accusations to be the final word. It exists because history shows us what happens when unchecked power decides who is guilty and who is innocent without a fair process. It exists because justice isn't about convenience, it's about principle. And Goldman nailed this point. He said outright, he's not advocating for Garcia, he's advocating for a court order, for the Supreme Court, for the rule of law. Because once the government gets away with denying due process to one person, it creates a precedent that can be used against anyone. And let me tell you, history shows us exactly where that road leads. We've seen it with the Red Scare. We've seen it with Japanese internment during World War II. We've seen it with McCarthyism. Every time the government is allowed to say, these people don't get rights because we've labeled them dangerous, it spirals. And eventually, it's not just gang members or alleged terrorists. It's immigrants, it's activists, it's political opponents, it's you. And that's what made this clash so revealing, because while Goldman was laser-focused on the Constitution, Noem was laser-focused on power. She didn't care that the Supreme Court ruled 9-0. She didn't care that the judiciary had spoken. She wanted to defend the executive branch's decision. And in doing so, she exposed the arrogance of unchecked authority. Goldman kept coming back to the same question. What steps has the administration taken to comply with the Supreme Court order? The court didn't say shrug your shoulders. The court didn't say do nothing. The court said facilitate. And facilitate is an active verb. It requires action. It requires steps to make due process happen. And yet, when pressed, Noem had nothing. No answer, no plan, no respect for the ruling. Instead, she flipped the script. She accused Goldman of fighting for a terrorist. She tried to paint him as soft on crime, as if defending the Constitution somehow meant defending MS-13. And that's the trick authoritarian-minded leaders always use. They turn the defense of rights into a smear. They tell you that if you care about due process, you're siding with the criminals. They try to force you into a false choice, safety or freedom. But the truth is, without freedom, safety is an illusion. Without rights, law enforcement power becomes limitless. And limitless power is far more dangerous than any gang. That's why this exchange matters so much. It wasn't just Goldman being feisty. It wasn't just Noem being stubborn. It was a microcosm of the broader struggle we face in America right now. Whether our institutions are strong enough to stand up to executive overreach, whether our courts still have authority, whether Congress is willing to fight for the Constitution instead of letting it be trampled. And here's the sobering reality. If the executive branch can ignore a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling and face no consequences, then the separation of power is a fiction. Then the judiciary is powerless. Then the Constitution is just words on paper. And Goldman was right to be outraged. He was right to demand answers. He was right to remind the American people that due process isn't about Garcia or MS-13 or any one case. It's about the survival of democracy itself. So let's take this seriously, because it would be easy to dismiss this as just another heated moment in a hearing, but it's not. It's a warning. It's a glimpse into how fragile our institutions can be when those in power decide the rules don't apply to them. And it's a reminder that defending the Constitution is not partisan, it's patriotic. Dan Goldman showed what it means to stand up for that principle, even when it's unpopular, even when it risks being twisted against him. Kristi Noem, on the other hand, showed what happens when power becomes more important than the law. And that's the choice facing America. Do we want leaders who defend the Constitution, even when it's hard, or leaders who bend it to suit their agenda? Because we can't have both. Things got heated on Capitol Hill when Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman clashed with Republican Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem over the controversial case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. At the heart of the exchange, a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling that said Garcia was denied due process, something Goldman pressed hard on, while Noem dodged, deflected, and outright refused to commit to following the order. What unfolded was a fiery back and forth that exposed just how far Republicans are willing to bend the Constitution when it suits their narrative,